there's plenty of evidence that Donald Trump's nativism, this kind of white racism, is actually limiting and hampering greater growth. When you look at governors like Ron DeSantis, Republican governor of Florida, Greg Abbott, Republican governor of Texas, former Republican governor of Arizona, Doug Ducey, all of these governors have something in common. They're large Hispanic states. They all met or considerably exceeded Donald Trump's numbers with Hispanic voters, which tells us it's very strong evidence that if Donald Trump wasn't in the way, Republicans would be doing even better.
Of course, we talk about things like Latino votes, like there's one big block of the same sort of people, all with the same sort of ideas, and that's not true. But I suppose the issue of ethnic minority voting is going to be big in this election. What's your initial thinking in this direction?
Well, I've been saying for some time now, and actually the premise of the book and the argument I've been making to both parties and presidential candidates is that the whole concept of ethnic minority voting is changing dramatically and rapidly in the United States. The main reason is because with Latinos, which is really the fastest growing segment of the electorate and the population, what we're seeing is explosive growth with third and now fourth generation Latino voters who don't really have as strong of an ethnic or racial perspective as previous generations had. And so they very much overwhelmingly view themselves as quote unquote typical Americans. And the issues that are driving them, and this, what I think has been loosely characterized as a rightward shift, is really a function of economics taking front row and center and being much more persuasive to this fast-growing segment of the vote than what has historically been sort of minority voting or racial votes or immigration issues.
So does that mean that previously ethnic minority voting, the Democrats would have a big chunk of that? They just have a chunk of that because of the identity of the voters. And are you saying that there's a sort of conservative aspect of their voting behavior now that's going to become more and more pronounced? Presumably this is an opportunity for Donald Trump, I guess.
Well, look, this shift has been happening for the better part of a decade now. It was most pronounced in 2020, 40 years ago, when Donald Trump kind of surprised a lot of people. Some of us were saying this, the polling is showing this, it's going to happen. A lot of people dismissed it as polling error. An 8-point shift. That's an enormous shift in a country where everything is really stratified and polarized. The short answer to your question is yes, indeed, the Democrats are unlikely, unless they make some significant adjustments, and they've begun to under Kamala Harris, change away from an ethnic minority perspective and really double down on sort of working class issues. One of the most dynamic changes that has characterized the country has been what we call the diploma divide, which is those with a college degree are far more likely to vote with the Democratic Party. Those without a college degree far more likely to vote with the Republican Party. Latinos constitute the fastest growing segment of the non-college educated blue collar worker. And they're tending to take on those political characteristics. Again, because they match basically every characteristic of the white non-college educated workforce and don't see themselves all that differently. Overwhelmingly, they kind of associate with them racially, ethnically, economically, from a class perspective, and they're voting accordingly. And so, yes, the Republicans are the beneficiaries and have been for the better part of a decade.
It's interesting that because the same is true in this country, that the Labour left wing is associated with university education, and the right wing is associated more with people who didn't go to university. It's a similar split happening over here. Does the fact that Kamala Harris comes from an ethnic background change this? Does that make the identity politics aspect of it any different at all? Trump versus Kamala Harris rather than Trump versus Joe Biden?
Well, it's a really fascinating question because the answer is yes, but probably not for the reason people think. It's not that there's an ethnic affinity between somebody who's black and somebody who is brown, Latinos and African Americans. It's actually because Kamala Harris has done something rather remarkable, which is she has decisively moved away from this racial identity politics, which has characterized the Democratic Party for her entire career and most pronounced since 2012, since the Obama years. She's taken a decidedly conservative position tack on immigration reform, for example, moved it away from the reform measures, away from the pathway to citizenship that has defined the Democratic Party, and is talking exclusively about border security, hiring thousands of new law enforcement border agents, building a wall, prosecuting transnational gangs, shutting down fentanyl, drugs. She's running basically what are Republican ads, conservative ads. In fact, she's adopted what's called the Lankford Bill, which was a conservative Republican from Oklahoma who negotiated this border security wall and taken it on as her own. So the Democratic candidate, a black woman, has now adopted a very conservative policy platform on border security. This is unheard of just 3 months ago. But it's because Latino voters specifically are shifting quickly away from the Democratic Party on these issues because they don't see them as racially charged. And Kamala Harris really has to lock down this frame, this perspective of her as somebody who is strong, who supports law enforcement, who really breaks through the stereotype of what an African-American woman from San Francisco typifies.
Is there how much is there racial charge around Trump? Because his critics will throw around terms like racist. He has won the votes of people of ethnic minorities in the past and will do so again in November. Is there any damage to him in terms of the view of him as someone who is racially suspected as a racist? People make that charge all the time.
Yeah, and I think those are very legitimate charges. I think they're accurate. And again, that begs the question which you're asking, which is, well, how is that possible? How are you winning non-white votes if you're a racist? The answer, again, goes back to kind of what I was suggesting, which is most of these third and fourth generation Latinos don't view themselves as racially distinct. Their issues are economic. Their issues are protectionist. Their issues are where they are concerned about immigration, and usually they're not top of mind. But when they are, they're for border security, not on immigration reform. They're not focused on a pathway to citizenship nearly as much as they are stopping these flows of the undocumented coming across the border. So there's no question that that's a part of it. And I would also suggest that there's plenty of evidence that Donald Trump's nativism, this kind of white racism, is actually limiting and hampering greater growth. When you look at governors like Ron DeSantis, Republican governor of Florida, Greg Abbott, Republican governor of Texas, former Republican governor of Arizona, Doug Ducey, all of these governors have something in common. They're large Hispanic states. They all met or considerably exceeded Donald Trump's numbers with Hispanic voters, which tells us it's very strong evidence that if Donald Trump wasn't in the way, Republicans would be doing even better. And so there's this huge economic demographic shift that is a much bigger dynamic than this old racial construct that Americans specifically are it's a part of it's been cemented into our vernacular in the way that we view the world, and that's becoming something that's a little bit more of a relic of the Gen X baby boomer generation and younger folks, because most of this shift towards republicanism is happening with voters under 30, US born third generation, US born Hispanics under the age of 30. They're not reacting to minority and racial politics the way we have traditionally viewed them.
That's so interesting. It may benefit the Republicans in a post-Trump world in 4 years' time,
Precisely.
or 8 years' time, or wherever. Just finally, I mean, the race fascinates people over here, Mike. How do you call it
here?
Yeah, I bet it does. How are you calling it now? You see, Kamala Harris has been in position for a month or so, whatever it is. The polls look hugely tight. The swing states are going to be obviously the thing that matters. How are you seeing it?
Well, basically like that. And that was something that I kind of was suggesting early on is the polls are going to be very, very tight for a long time. The United States is extremely polarized. We're not seeing much movement with many groups. There are two that are discernible. One, of course, is this U.S.-born Hispanic group that we're talking about, which is behaving more Republican than we're used to seeing. The other is college-educated white voters that are moving to the left. They're becoming, because of cultural issues, not economic issues, they're moving towards the Democratic Party. They're worried about gun control. They're worried about abortion rights. They're worried about same-sex marriage. There's one small sliver moving to the left. There's one small sliver moving to the right. The battleground states will determine it, but my strong suspicion is it will be very similar to what we traditionally see in the United States, which is an extraordinarily close race. Probably very, very similar to 2020. The polls are falling almost exactly into line demographically, geographically, from a partisan perspective, as what we saw in 2020. So I think that's probably how this is going to play out.
And the fear then is just finally, Mike, a small Trump loss is a big worry for the how
World.
democracy, for how democracy will function in America.
Yeah.
Presumably that's the biggest,
Yeah.
almost the worst case scenario, whatever your politics, would be a small Trump loss, because whether the system can handle the shock of that, presumably is very much up for question.
Well, yeah, I think that's exactly right, and there's a couple of good things about that, a couple of bad things about that as we prepare for that possibility, likelihood, I would argue. That is, we're grateful he's not the incumbent and using the power of the federal government to kind of do things differently than he did last time. But the second is they've learned a lot more, and my strong sense is that the attempted assassination attempt is probably the first of unfortunately what may end up being violent means to disrupt the processing and counting of ballots, state by state, county by county. So the chain of command is what we call it, which is when an actual voter puts the vote in the ballot box, getting down to the government center to count them. That's an area that is ripe for disruption. You spread that over hundreds of counties, over half a dozen states, and there's plenty of opportunities for a lot of mayhem in a very close race.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. Mike, great to speak to you. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thanks for having me.